The instant my stepfather Richard picked up the microphone at my wedding reception, I felt it, something awful was coming. He was swaying just a little, holding his third whiskey sour in his left hand, wearing that smug smile I'd known my whole life. It was a warning sign. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what he actually did. My name is Millie Hatfield. I'm 29 years old, and what should have been the happiest day of my life turned into a nightmare that would later lead to the most unexpected justice. Before I go on, hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Thank you. Richard was never supposed to give a speech. The toasts were planned: David's best man, my maid of honor, and then David's father. But Richard ignored all of that. He tapped the microphone 3 times, that sharp screech making everyone flinch, and announced what he called his honest blessing. He started with fake compliments about how I'd finally found someone willing to marry me despite my complicated family. Then he moved on to stories about my mother's depression after my father left, speaking as if mental illness was something shameful, something that made us less than everyone else. My mother had died 3 years earlier, and here he was using her memory as a weapon on my wedding day. The room went dead silent except for the faint clicking of my mother-in-law Margaret's pearls as she shifted in discomfort. She already believed I wasn't good enough for her precious David because I came from what she liked to call a broken home. Richard was only proving every ugly belief she had. But he wasn't finished. He announced to all 150 guests that he had paid for this little fantasy wedding and that he was shutting down the open bar immediately because he had already spent enough on my so-called pipe dreams. Those were his exact words, pipe dreams, to describe my marriage to David. Then came the cruelest part. He said I should be thankful he had fed and housed me after my mother died, like I was some stray animal he'd taken in out of pity. The wedding planner stared at me in shock. The bartender froze mid-pour. My cousin Jessica dropped her shrimp cocktail, and it hit the floor with a loud splat that echoed in the silence. I rose slowly, the soft sound of my dress filling the room. David reached for my hand, but I gently pulled back. I walked up to the microphone where Richard stood, still smirking, probably expecting tears or begging. Instead, I smiled, the same practiced smile I'd worn through years of his cruelty. I took the microphone from him and calmly said the reception was over and everyone was welcome to take the centerpieces home. And then I left. I walked straight out of my own wedding reception, my train trailing behind me like a queen leaving her court. David followed, of course, he's that kind of man. But not before his groomsman Marcus accidentally spilled Richard's whiskey all over his rented tux. Marcus always had perfect timing. What Richard never knew, what he never cared to learn in his arrogance, was that my mother had been a brilliant software engineer. Those pipe dreams he mocked? I inherited her sharp mind, her focus, and her habit of keeping careful records. The company Richard now ran, the one that funded his country club lifestyle and his ridiculous midlife crisis Porsche, was built entirely on my mother's code and patents. 3 days after the wedding disaster, while David and I were supposed to be in Bermuda for our honeymoon, I was instead sitting on my couch in pajamas, eating ice cream straight from the tub. Ben and Jerry's Cherry Garcia, in case you're curious, because if you can't use chocolate as therapy after your stepfather ruins your wedding, when can you? That's when Eddie Chen knocked on my door. Eddie had been our wedding photographer, but more than that, he'd worked with my mother 20 years earlier when they were both at Tech Innovations. He stood at my door with his camera bag and a manila envelope that would change everything. He said he'd wrestled with whether to come forward, but after what Richard did at the wedding, he couldn't stay silent anymore. My mother had trusted him with something she told him to give me only if Richard ever crossed the line. And if destroying my wedding didn't count as crossing it, I don't know what did. Inside the envelope was a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank and a sticky note in my mother's handwriting that read, "For my brilliant daughter. Trust your instincts, love. The truth always surfaces." David wanted to come with me to the bank, but he was stuck handling the fallout. His mother, Margaret, kept calling nonstop, switching between sympathy and quiet hints that maybe we should have just eloped to avoid all this family chaos, as if any of this was somehow my fault. David, bless him, tried to support me while managing her, but I could see how hard it was for him. He'd grown up in a world where conflict meant quiet tension and passive-aggressive Christmas cards, not public humiliation in a ballroom. The safety deposit box held 3 items: my mother's real will, a USB drive, and a leather journal packed with her notes. The will was signed just 2 months before she died, fully witnessed and notarized. It clearly stated that everything, the house, the company, the patents, would transfer to me on my 30th birthday. That was only 6 months away. But here's where it turned infuriating. After her death, Richard produced a different will, one that placed everything under his control for Millie's benefit until I turned 35. His version was dated just 1 week before she passed, when she'd been heavily medicated in the hospital. I remembered that week. She could barely hold a pen, let alone sign legal papers. The USB drive was even more damaging. It held email exchanges between Richard and his lawyer discussing how to restructure the inheritance for maximum profit. There were drafts of the fake will, conversations about which witnesses would cooperate, and worst of all, Richard's own admission that my mother had never agreed to any of it. Richard's company, Hatfield Technologies, still using my mother's maiden name for credibility, had grown from a tiny firm into a multi-million-dollar operation entirely because of her groundbreaking AI algorithms. The patents she filed, the code she stayed up late writing while I did my homework at the kitchen table, had become the foundation of supply chain systems used by major corporations. And then there was Brittany. Oh, Brittany. Richard's 24-year-old girlfriend, 5 years younger than me, had shown up at the wedding in a dress that cost more than some people's cars. She'd even tried to catch the bouquet, her sharp acrylic nails gleaming as she shoved past my college friends. She'd posted the whole disaster online, thinking she was clever with hashtags like #weddingdrama, #newmoney, and #trophy-girlfriend-life. The internet, as you can imagine, was not gentle with her in the comments. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the wedding. At first, it was worried friends and family. By the 3rd day, Richard started calling. Once, then 5 times, then 15. By evening, I had 31 missed calls. His voicemails shifted from furious demands that I apologize, to nervous requests to talk business, to outright threats of legal action for defamation, as if repeating his own words could be defamation. Herbert Goldstein was 78, technically retired, and absolutely delighted to hear from me. He'd been my mother's lawyer before Richard convinced her to switch to a friend who offered a family discount. Herbert never trusted Richard, and being proven right after all these years seemed to energize him more than his afternoon espresso. His office smelled like old books and peppermint. And his assistant was none other than Ashley Morrison, my high school mean girl who used to mock my worn-out clothes. Karma has a sense of humor, because Ashley recognized me instantly and said, "Oh, thank God you're here. We've been waiting for you to figure it out. Your mom was brilliant, and that man is a leech." Turns out Ashley had grown up, earned her paralegal certification, and developed a strong sense of right and wrong. She'd also been secretly copying files for 3 years, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Herbert laid everything out with the dramatic flair of a man waiting for one last big case. The real will was airtight. The fake one was full of holes. Richard's witnesses included his golfing buddy who'd been in Florida that week and a notary whose license had expired 2 years before the supposed signing. It was careless, arrogant work, exactly Richard's style. But there was a bigger issue. Richard had already moved most of the liquid assets into company investments, and the house had been refinanced twice. Getting it all back meant proving fraud, and that meant we needed more evidence. Herbert suggested digging into the company's contracts, especially the major government deal Richard had been boasting about for months. If you're enjoying this wild ride, my friends, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support truly means everything and helps these stories reach others. Ashley had been investigating on her own as well. She discovered that Richard's business partner, Joaquin Reeves, had been trying to leave the partnership for nearly a year, but Richard kept blocking him with legal tricks. We even learned he'd hired his own forensic accountant to audit the books. But Richard had threatened to ruin Joaquin's reputation if he went public with any concerns about ownership. The government contract was the breakthrough. Worth $50 million over 5 years, it required undisputed ownership of all intellectual property. The patents couldn't have any disputes tied to them. Richard had been filing claims listing himself as the sole inventor, conveniently leaving out the fact that my mother's name was on every original patent. I made an anonymous call to Richard's biggest rival, Innovative Solutions, suggesting they take a deeper look at Hatfield Technologies' patent history before the government finalized its decision. Then I called the Government Accountability Office's fraud hotline, just to cover every angle. And the best part? Richard's paranoia was already spiraling out of control. According to my Aunt Sharon, Richard's own sister, who had always been kind to me despite him, he had completely unraveled. He installed new security cameras all over the office, hired a private investigator to follow me, and started accusing his own employees of being spies. He even fired his longtime secretary just because she questioned discrepancies in the patent paperwork. Meanwhile, Brittany was living in a different reality, totally unaware of the storm closing in. She posted nonstop from her spa weekend, her Neiman Marcus shopping trip, and her brand new Tesla, all with captions like CEO's girlfriend perks and building an empire. The woman couldn't spell entrepreneur but had already put it in her LinkedIn bio. Herbert's assistant Ashley turned out to be a secret weapon. She'd been screenshotting everything, building a digital trail of Richard and Brittany's spending while the company was technically in financial trouble. Every purchase made with company money. Every 5-star business dinner with no actual business. Every luxury vacation written off as a corporate retreat. Ashley had proof of all of it. The universe really does have timing. The very morning I learned the full government contract requirements, Richard posted on LinkedIn about taking Hatfield Technologies to the next level, along with a photo of himself standing in front of my mother's portrait in the lobby. The same portrait he'd wanted removed the year before because he said it looked outdated. The comments were already filling with congratulations from people who had no idea what was coming. Joaquin Reeves reached out through Herbert. We met at a small downtown cafe, the type of place Richard would never step into because there was no valet parking. Joaquin looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from losing a battle slowly. He told me Richard had been cooking the books for years, shifting money between accounts to hide the fact that he'd been using company funds for personal expenses. But what finally destroyed Richard was his ego. He had been so sure of his power that he put everything in writing, emails ordering Joaquin to falsify reports, text messages about hiding assets, even a recorded phone call where Richard flat out said, "My mother's patents are technically the company's now, and Millie would never be smart enough to figure it out." We had all the proof, but Joaquin had been too scared to act because Richard had leverage on him too, an old tax issue Richard had inflated into a career-ending threat. But now, with the government contract on the line and my patent evidence in place, Joaquin finally had the upper hand. We mapped out our move like a chess game. First, Joaquin's forensic accountant would submit their findings to the Government Review Board. Then I would file my patent claim with the U.S. Patent Office using my mother's original work and my legal inheritance. Finally, Herbert would file an emergency injunction stopping Richard from signing anything for Hatfield Technologies. Timing was critical. The government's final contract decision was 1 week away. Richard had already scheduled a celebration at the country club, champagne fountain, live band, the whole fantasy. Brittany had bought a new $3,000 sequin dress and posed with it on Instagram, captioning it, "Future Mrs. CEO ready to celebrate." By this point, Richard's paranoia had reached absurd levels. According to the Office Gossip Network, which Ashley had fully infiltrated, he was making employees sign new NDAs every morning, had installed keystroke loggers on every computer, and had hired 3 different investigation firms to spy on each other. He even accused the janitor of being a corporate spy because the man asked about my mother's portrait. The irony was almost poetic. Richard, who built everything on my mother's brilliance, couldn't even understand the basic code she wrote. He'd hired engineers to maintain it, but none truly understood the clean, elegant logic behind her algorithms. They had patched and layered fixes for years, creating a tangled mess that barely worked. Meanwhile, I'd spent my teen years learning to code from my mother, learning the why, not just the how. Richard called an emergency family meeting for Sunday afternoon at his house, technically my mother's house, but I wasn't ready to pull that trigger yet. The group text he sent was pure manipulation. Need all family members present to discuss Millie's recent unstable behavior and its impact on our family's reputation. Coffee and pastries will be served. Unstable behavior. The man who destroyed my wedding was calling me unstable. It would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. I arrived 15 minutes late on purpose, wearing my mother's favorite blazer and carrying her old leather briefcase. The living room was packed. Sharon sat looking uneasy. Cousins had driven in from nearby states. My mother's 84-year-old Aunt Ruth had flown in from Phoenix. And shockingly, David's mother, Margaret, was there too, apparently invited by Richard to witness the so-called intervention. Richard stood by the fireplace like he was giving a State of the Union speech. Brittany perched on the arm of his chair wearing what I can only describe as business casual meets Vegas showgirl, a blazer with nothing underneath but a lace bralette. Subtlety was never her thing. Richard began his rehearsed speech about my vindictive behavior after his harmless wedding toast, how I was trying to destroy the family business out of spite, and how he was even considering having me evaluated for mental health issues, just like your poor mother, he added, with fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. That was when I opened the briefcase. The click of the lock sounded impossibly loud in the silent room. I laid everything out, the real will, the forged one, the emails, the patent records, and one special surprise, Richard's tax returns showing how he'd claimed my mother's patents as his own inventions for tax benefits. But the real shock was what I had uncovered that very morning. Richard hadn't just stolen from me. He had been managing Aunt Ruth's retirement fund and secretly borrowed $200,000 for a temporary business investment that was never repaid. He'd convinced my cousin Michael to invest his kids' college savings into a fake subsidiary that existed only on paper. He had even taken loans against Sharon's house without her knowledge. The room exploded. Aunt Ruth, sweet, 84-year-old Aunt Ruth, stood up and called Richard something that rhymed with trucking faster. Michael looked like he was about to be sick. Sharon went pale, then red, then a frightening shade of purple. And my cousin Todd, bless his millennial soul, was live-tweeting the entire disaster in real time. His live commentary included lines like, "Uncle Dick just got exposed harder than my freshman year Facebook photos," and "Auntie Millie pulled out receipts like a CVS checkout." The tweets went viral within hours, though we didn't know that yet. Richard tried to seize back control, shouting about family loyalty and accusing me of twisting the truth. That's when Brittany, sweet, empty-headed Brittany, made her fatal mistake. She laughed and said, "Oh come on, Rich. Just pay them off like you did with that accountant last year." The silence that followed was crushing. Even Todd stopped typing. Richard turned to Brittany in pure panic. Realizing what she'd just said, she tried to backpedal. "I mean, the accountant you helped with his mortgage, as a company gift." Aunt Sharon finally spoke, her voice quiet but deadly calm, asking which accountant, and why anyone needed to be paid off. Richard's stuttering, scrambled reply told everyone exactly what they needed to know. David's mother, Margaret, who had been silent the entire time, stood and walked over to me. I braced myself for another lecture about embarrassing the family. Instead, she said, "Millie, I owe you an apology. I misjudged everything. This man is a criminal, and you've shown far more grace than I ever could." Then she turned to Richard and added, "You disgust me. What you did at the wedding had nothing to do with Millie. It was about you, an insecure, pathetic little man who can't stand to see anyone else happy." Coming from Margaret, who usually showed emotion by barely tightening her lips, it landed like a nuclear strike. Monday morning arrived like Christmas, if Christmas meant subpoenas and federal investigators at 9 a.m. sharp. The Government Accountability Office announced it was suspending the contract review pending an investigation into credible claims of intellectual property fraud. By 9:30, Richard's company inbox was flooded with panicked investor messages. At 10 a.m., Joaquin, finally free to move, filed his lawsuit. he didn't just want out. He wanted damages for fraud, emotional distress, and defamation. His lawyer turned out to be Herbert's former partner, who'd apparently been holding a 20-year grudge over some golf club incident I didn't even want to ask about. By noon, 3 major clients had pulled their contracts, citing concerns over company stability and leadership ethics. The fourth, a Fortune 500 company, sent an emergency legal team to the office for an immediate audit. They arrived to find Richard trying to shred documents while Brittany stuffed hard drives into her oversized Hermes bag. The banks moved even faster. The loans Richard had taken using the patents as collateral suddenly became a massive problem once ownership was disputed. First National froze the company accounts. Commerce Bank called in their credit line. Even the company credit card stopped working, which Brittany discovered at lunch at the country club, when her card was declined and she had to call a friend to rescue her. The whole thing collapsed like a house of cards, and Richard stood in the middle of it, still insisting it was all a misunderstanding. He called an emergency board meeting, forgetting that half the board consisted of my mother's former colleagues, people who had stayed silent out of respect for her. They weren't silent anymore. That afternoon brought my favorite moment of the entire saga. Brittany, realizing the money train had derailed, tried to grab what she could from the wreckage. She went to Richard's office to retrieve her jewelry from the safe, the same jewelry he'd bought with company funds and written off as client entertainment. The safe was empty. Richard had already pawned everything to pay the lawyers he'd hired that morning. The screaming match that followed echoed 3 floors down. Brittany called him every name imaginable and a few that probably haven't made it into any dictionary yet. She threw his golf trophies out the window, most of them were participation trophies anyway. She dumped his protein shakes all over his car seats. And then she posted a breakup announcement on Instagram, single again. Turns out he's broker than broke. Onward to new beginnings. And a new sugar daddy. Not my circus. Not my monkeys. By 5 p.m., Richard's country club membership was revoked. Bouncing a $50,000 event deposit tends to be frowned upon. His golf buddies, the same ones who laughed at his wedding toast, suddenly didn't know him. The club president even called me to apologize for any distress their former member had caused, which was polite code for, "Please don't sue us." We had no idea he was using stolen money. That evening, the local news picked up Todd's tweets. The wedding toast disaster had already gone viral over the weekend, and now the business collapse was trending everywhere. The headline read, "Local CEO's wedding toast triggers company collapse, federal investigation launched." They even had video from the wedding. Turns out the videographer kept filming during Richard's speech, assuming it was planned. The footage was devastating. By midnight, Richard had left me 31 voicemails, each more desperate than the last, shifting from legal threats to guilt trips about family loyalty to outright begging. The final one was just him sobbing. I didn't feel sorry for him. Well, maybe a little sorry for his liver, which had probably processed more alcohol that day than in the past month combined. Tuesday at 2:47 a.m., I know the exact time because that's when my Ring doorbell exploded with alerts. Richard showed up at my front door, completely wasted. Not just drunk. The kind of drunk where you think you can fight a mailbox and win. He'd apparently taken an Uber after the driver refused to take him to 3 other stops, including his lawyer's house and, for some reason, a Waffle House. He pounded on the door, shouting that this was his house anyway, that my mother had promised him everything, that I was an ungrateful brat who needed to learn respect. He was clutching a messy stack of papers, the fake will, some made-up receipts, and what looked like a crayon-drawn contract. The man had brought kindergarten-level forgeries to a legal war. David tried to reason with him through the Ring speaker, but Richard started threatening to break down the door with a garden gnome. My garden gnome. The one my mother had painted to look like a little wizard. That was it. Our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had already called 911. She was watching the whole scene from her window with her cat. Both of them completely scandalized. She later told me she'd been waiting 3 whole years for a valid excuse to call the police on Richard, ever since he complained about her wind chimes. When the officers arrived, they found him trying to pry open the lock with a credit card. A declined credit card, because apparently the universe enjoys irony. He instantly began yelling about his rights, claiming he owned the house and that I was trespassing on his property. He shoved his stack of forged papers at the cops, unaware that one of them was Officer Martinez, whose mother had worked with mine at Tech Innovations years earlier. Officer Martinez glanced at the documents, noticed they were dated 3 different years on the same page, and calmly asked Richard if he had been drinking. Richard straightened up and declared, "I've been drinking, success, officer. This is my house. Arrest her for trespassing." Then he made his worst possible decision. He tried to shove past the officers to reach my door. That's when things took a turn. Turns out alcohol wasn't the only thing in his system. According to Brittany's Instagram story later, he'd also taken what she called confidence pills, which I'm fairly sure didn't come from a real doctor. The officers cuffed him for attempted breaking and entering, public intoxication, and assault on an officer, though his attempt to shove Officer Martinez was more like an aggressive stumble. As they escorted him toward the police car, he began listing all the powerful people he supposedly knew who would revoke their badges. The list included 2 retired mayors, a made-up senator, and somehow, Judge Judy. But here's the best part. During the routine search, they found a USB drive in his pocket. In his drunken brilliance, Richard had been carrying the original files he used to forge my mother's will, including a Word document actually titled "Real Will Final Use This One." David's mother, Margaret, had been staying in our guest room since the family meeting because she didn't want to miss anything. She came outside in her robe and slippers to watch Richard being arrested, sipping tea from my mother's favorite mug like she was watching a British crime show. She even waved as the car pulled away. The police report was unforgettable. It included Richard declaring himself a sovereign citizen, trying to bribe them with a company check that absolutely wouldn't clear, and announcing that he planned to buy the entire police department and turn it into a parking lot. Officer Martinez noted that the suspect appeared confused about basic reality. Somehow, the local news arrived almost immediately. Mrs. Patterson may or may not have called them, she denies it while smiling. The footage of Richard being led away in handcuffs, still shouting about his house and his rights, became what the internet calls an instant classic. Someone set it to circus music, and it hit 2 million views on TikTok. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Richard stood before Judge Patricia Winters, a woman who had gone to law school with my mother and had absolutely zero tolerance for document fraud. Richard's lawyer, the third one after the first 2 quit, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, possibly inside an active volcano. The criminal charges were only the beginning. The real destruction came during the civil case, where Herbert dismantled Richard's defense piece by piece. Every forged document was exposed. Every fake transfer tracked. Every lie unraveled. Richard insisted he had only been protecting my interests, that my mother had verbally approved everything. Judge Winters asked if he had any witnesses to these so-called agreements. Richard actually suggested using a Ouija board to ask my mother. The judge did not find that amusing. The verdict was swift and devastating. Richard was convicted of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. His sentence included 2 to 5 years in prison and full restitution of everything he had stolen. The civil ruling restored everything to me, the house, the company, the patents, and added damages for emotional distress. The judge also ordered punitive damages for what she called a particularly cruel abuse of trust. Richard's face drained of all color as he finally understood that he had lost absolutely everything. Then Judge Winters addressed him directly. "Mr. Garrett, you stood at this young woman's wedding and humiliated her, claiming she should be grateful for your charity. The only true charity here was her mother's love for you, and you repaid it with theft and betrayal. The court hopes you use your time in custody to finally understand what the word family truly means." I took control of Hatfield Technologies the very next day. The employees, who had been living under Richard's paranoia, actually applauded when I walked through the door. I rehired his secretary with a raise and a formal apology. Joaquin became my official business partner, this time with real contracts and everything done legally. We secured the government contract once I proved the patents were rightfully mine. The company portrait wall was redesigned. Richard's photo came down, replaced with a larger portrait of my mother. Beneath it, I added her favorite quote, "Innovation requires imagination, but success requires integrity." David and I finally took our Bermuda honeymoon as planned, this time in a far nicer suite paid for by the settlement. Margaret came to the airport with champagne and a handwritten apology that made me cry. She's fiercely protective of me now, proudly telling everyone at her book club that her daughter-in-law is a CEO who took down a corrupt man with pure strategy. Richard's prison emails started arriving a week later. They go straight to my lawyer. Apparently, he's found religion, or at least discovered that the chapel has air conditioning. He works in the prison library now, which feels fitting, surrounded by books about laws he broke. Brittany tried to write a tell-all book called Gold Digger's Regret, My Life with a Con Man, but since she'd signed an NDA back when she thought Richard had money, she couldn't publish it without paying damages she couldn't afford. Last I heard, she was dating a cryptocurrency influencer who was absolutely not running a Ponzi scheme, according to his YouTube channel. The wedding reception redo happened 6 months later. Same venue, same guests, minus Richard. This time, the toast celebrated love instead of tearing it apart. Aunt Ruth gave a beautiful speech about my mother's strength living on through me. Even Todd managed to speak without mentioning Twitter once. My mother's AI algorithm recently won an Industry Innovation Award. I accepted it on her behalf, wearing her blazer, the one she wore the day she first pitched the idea that built an empire. An empire Richard tried to steal but never truly understood. I keep one of those 31 voicemails from that night, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder. In it, Richard says, "I'll never be half the businessperson she is." He was right. I'm twice the person he ever was, because I learned from the best. My mother didn't just leave me code and patents. She left me the truth that real success isn't about taking, it's about building something that lasts. The company is thriving. The house is peaceful. And the little wizard garden gnome still stands watch at the front door, unbroken and unbowed, just like the women who painted it and the daughter who inherited their strength.